hard at work here. I grew up here on the southwest side of Fort Wayne and got some deep roots here. And this is a story that I've just sort of been picking away at over the years, over the decades. So yeah, the Wabash and Maumee Portage. It's really a system from the Great Lakes to connect to the Wabash, as we all know. But it's a story of land, water, and very much the human story of Indiana. Wabash and Maumee Rivers, one of the main points I want to make is, you know, I think it's sort of been understated, the importance of the Wabash-Maumee corridor. It really was an important part, and it still is, of a transcontinental transport system linking the Gulf of Mexico to the North Atlantic. Of course, is the Maumee into Lake Erie. That's the Wabash. This is the Ohio, and there's the mighty Mississippi, of which we're mostly part of that drainage. But the very interesting thing is these were the capitals of New France during the colonial race for empire that was colonizing the New World in North America, starting, you know, in the 1600s, the very earliest European colonization. But really, this was from these capitals. This is where they managed their New France. And so between New Orleans, where of course you could go back to Europe, and here was the closest way to Europe, actually the very quickest portage through the back around all the British settlements, the English colonies, was through the Wabash corridor. So anyways, really we had the one big portage here, and after that it was all downstream to New Orleans. There were no other portages on the Wabash and Ohio and Mississippi. And then going east, there was, of course, the big portage at Niagara, and then a couple other 3 rapids that they had to carry around in between Lake Ontario and Montreal. So the land before the route, geologic origins. Okay, we all know we've got a post-glacial landscape here. We love it. We're proud of it. It's a fascinating story. But all these huge continental ice sheets, which basically were 1,000 miles along where their origin was, well, by Hudson Bay, and they extended, the Wisconsin was the last of those, and ended relatively recently, you know, 13,000 years ago. But, so we're all familiar with that, all those big lobes. And we've got these amazing LiDAR digital elevation maps now that really help us see. Indiana sort of looks like the Himalayas a little. These are the highest elevations here, and there's the lowest, of course, in these Ohio and Wabash lowlands, we call that region. But probably our most prominent landform is the Wabash River. And of course, there we are with these. You can see these series of moraines where that last ice lobe, what eventually formed Lake Erie, receded and hesitated at a number of points. There's the Fort Wayne moraine, there's a Wabash moraine, there's a Salamone moraine, there's a Mississinewa, and there's another one out here called New Union, right? And you can see that lobe distinctly receding. And of course, there's where it sat and was in a big puddle of water. It was like an ice cube in water. And it was all, as the climate warmed, there was a big glacial lake there, post-glacial lake, Lake Maumee. And that, of course, is the Black Swamp region. You go out east of Fort Wayne, and torrential meltwaters breach the Fort Wayne moraine and pour through the Wabash Valley. Really, and that's what carved and created the current valley. It's sort of a recent thing, the Wabash Valley. It wasn't there for millions of years. It's about 13,000 years ago. It was when it was formed. So moraines and torrents. Everybody knows what a moraine is? Yeah, it's a big ridge of typically sand and gravel and boulders as well that formed on the edge of the glacial ice sheets. And a torrent is, at the end of the Ice Age, we had this incredible meltwater. The whole world was awash. All these streams were giant rapids. So anyways, here are all the moraines. Pretty fascinating map, isn't it? But we see our amazing Fort Wayne moraine actually is through 3 states. And actually, Stellhorn Road follows the boundary. This is where the big Black Swamp was. There's actually a little smaller moraine out there. It's a little ridge. It's kind of interesting there that the Auglaize River is associated with. Over at Defiance, right, Ohio. Some of you guys have Northwest Ohio roots. Is that possible? In Fort Wayne? So anyways, there's our amazing Fort Wayne moraine right there. And of course you can see the breaches in it. There's the Tillman Ditch. And there's the, where the mighty, it was all flowing this way when the glacier was melting. It was a big glacial fluvial outwash valley. And all this material was pouring out. But it was also dammed. It was dammed for a long time. These moraines do often create dams. And there's the Maumee Torrent map. There's the glacial lake Maumee. These Fort Wayne moraines up there by IPFW and Stellhorn Road. They're actually beach deposits and so on. And there were these weak spots in the moraine, sags in the moraine. And it blew out. It was just brim full of massive water. And it happened, it was still during the Ice Age. The ice sheets had retreated north of Indiana, but it was, I think, about 14,000 years ago. Not technically the end of the Pleistocene, the Ice Age, but it all blew out through there. So this is, I'm not afraid to work with artificial intelligence, and they got some pretty neat, you can do some simulations and stuff, so that's my example of the moraine giving out with a big torrential meltwater coming through it, which we are on top of. So the portage started as a natural passage. It basically was a short overland carry. It's often another word, English word for portage. Connected two enormous watersheds, the Mississippi and Great Lakes. So here we are with a little more modern LiDAR. This, of course, is the St. Mary's. That's Sweeney Park, tucked right in there. There's Foster Park. But here you can see very clearly the Little River, and also there's all these little scroll lines where it was meandering and moving around this valley. Here, of course, is the real drainage divide, which was, of course, a big peat bog. It was a very deep peatland right there. But you can clearly see west of Sweeney Park where the channel began. But tried to sort of reconstruct what this portage would look like during that amazing contact time when the Europeans were exploring the interior of North America and closely working with all these indigenous peoples, and these open oak woodlands were on the bluffs, and this big broad valley with this very marshy, shallow stream. And so indigenous homelands and trade, you know. Up in Madison, Wisconsin, they found all these dugout canoes, right? And they're 5,000 years old. Folks have been using boats, really. The indigenous peoples, which colonized from Asia, they had boats then. So humans have been using boats and getting around on water for a long time. Should I have it explained? These are actually my collection, and a friend of mine, Dr. Rick Jones, was the state archaeologist. He passed. These are all from Ellen County, and they document humans have been here for 13,500 years. This is the Paleo-Indian toolkit. That's called a high-low point. It's a Paleo-Indian, and was a very small dart tossed on an atlatl for big game. But this is the Thebes. It's about 10,000 years ago, and these folks were pretty capable hunters. Caribou hunting was a big thing. These small little points, those Clovis points everybody thinks are great big things, you know, for hunting elephants. A lot of them were tiny. They're like projectiles. They were trying to penetrate the cavity of these animals. But caribou were here in this post-glacial landscape, no trees. The modern forest came in 10,000 years ago. So there's a while there where humans were here. Wasn't the same, it was this boreal, it was like tundra essentially. Okay, New France. We got the, early 1600s, Jamestown, Pensacola, St. Augustine, Quebec and Montreal were being founded. The race for the New World had begun, and all these European powers were busy trying to colonize and claim it for theirs. And we were New France, and there was administration here, and there were actually Fort Wayne, we had posts along the Wabash, and Fort Miami's and Fort Wayne was a French post, and there was colonization here, and there are still French people here from that time. And basically they were it was held together by water routes and relationships. Everybody thinks how, a post, a fort in the wilderness, how did that control an area? It's relationships and trade. So 1715 was sort of the height of French expansion in North America. And that's when Fort Miami's here at Fort Wayne was established, as well as Fort Ouiatenon, which is at Lafayette, and they found the exact site. It isn't buried under a city like ours is and destroyed. And it's amazing what they're finding there. They had the wrong site for years and years, but now they've got it. And it's filled with indigenous people artifacts, French artifacts, American artifacts. It's really cool. And now, of course, also the third big post, French post along the Wabash. Anybody? Vincennes. And that was a big, powerful one as well. And still, it's very worth a visit. There's still French constructed residential houses there with the old daub and wattle and really interesting stuff. They were pretty good at colonizing, but the British did a lot better, and they had the Atlantic seaboard, the Anglo-Saxon peoples, and all the Celts too, and Scots and Irish that were coming in. But problem with the French, they had two routes in from France, and it was up here, of course, this St. Lawrence Seaway, and then New Orleans. And the Great Lakes was really what their empire was built around. So it was, they controlled the interior. This is 1750. It's kind of ended their decline. The British were getting so strong. And, people wonder why they didn't get down into the Ohio River and use that. But it was too perilous. Fort Duquesne, which was Pittsburgh now, actually a young general, or he wasn't a general then, he was a captain that was in the British Army. George Washington, captured Fort Duquesne. And that was a perilous, the French really couldn't use that upper area, so they were forced to go back here. There's not good portages in Ohio, the Ohio area. But so the war for the interior, the struggle for Indiana was a struggle for the corridors. And one thing the indigenous people endured in this time, it was truly 60 years of war. These children grew up with it. It was war after war, the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, when the French were expelled and Britain finally conquered North America. The Revolutionary War, America took this area from the British. And then the Northwest Indian War with Anthony Wayne and all that, Little Turtle. In the War of 1812 then with Tecumseh and the British, the last real struggle for this area, and it was very real. There was the young United States, all these indigenous peoples were closely plugged into a colonial power named England. And it went on for a long time, and it was a devastating time. And they had their kind of capital was out here, where they really were trying to control, administer, and look westward, the French. But the French chapter is pretty fascinating and not always told well. The French and Indian War, it's a lot of the indigenous peoples allied with the French against the British. 1754, 1763. Globally, it was a war in Europe too. It was known as the 7 Years' War. These two great powers, France and Britain, were really competing. But Pontiac, who was actually born on the Maumee River, where in Ohio now, east of Fort Wayne, a staunch French ally versus the British. And when that war ended, French had lost all control. They were gone from North America. The Treaty of Paris ceded all of this against the British, and then Pontiac just started right into a war of rebellion against the British. But he is a Maumee River, this corridor guy, Pontiac. He was a pretty interesting guy. He was in Ottawa. Okay, so American Revolution really quickly ended British control of the Wabash Valley. And there was wars here. We had Revolutionary War in the Wabash Valley. And there was General George Hamilton. He came all the way down from Detroit through the portage here. He's got a really interesting account, and I'll give you some stuff. He was the chief administrator and warrior for Britain out of Detroit. And George Rogers Clark had captured Fort Saxville, which is Vincennes, down in Indiana on the Wabash. And Hamilton came down to recapture it and lost. And that was very much a battleground in the Revolutionary War. And it's really a neat untold story too, somewhat. Vincennes is really worth a visit if you like this stuff. Hamilton's diary. I've actually got a copy of this. It's getting really hard to get, but he talks about leaving Detroit to Miamitown, Hamilton on the Maumee, Upper Wabash, Miamitown to Weohtanon, Weohtanon into Vincennes. Hamilton takes Vincennes, but he didn't hold it for very long. Clark recaptures Vincennes, 1779. And he came through, he was up at Detroit. It was the British stronghold and trying to control the western Great Lakes and Canada. They've still got Queen Elizabeth on their currency, right? Canada. He was kind of an interesting, well-educated guy. He was kind of very empathetic to the indigenous peoples for his times. And he was an observer and a writer. He kept this neat diary. One thing I really like is his account of beaver. I saw beaver back there on the wall, and how, you know, obviously the fur trade had been going on a long time by the time he came through in 1779, but he found this area full of beaver, and the indigenous people wouldn't touch them. Nobody was allowed to kill the beaver because they kept the portage water levels high. And he's got a the Indians are sensible of the advantages they draw from the labors of the beaver at this place. Will not suffer them to be killed in this neighborhood. And he talks about going through the shimmying cover. He used a lot of French words. Petite rivière. They call them pirogues. They drugged like 17 boats all the way from Detroit through this 8-mile-long portage, and then went down to Vincennes and captured Vincennes, Fort Sackville, and then lost it. But they call them pirogues. But that's it's an amazing account. It talks about the shimmying covera, which is covered ground, where the willow trees were growing over it and the snakes were above them. And it was a pretty interesting portage account. And the Northwest Indian War, of course, which is Anthony Wayne and Little Turtle. And this was real. Young United States was flexing its muscles. It was trying to assert its claim to this area. And it was also, the British were very active at Detroit and still trying to keep us out and arming the Indians. There were wagon loads of weaponry coming into Kikianga and all over. And it was, war hasn't changed in a lot of ways. It's pretty interesting, the dynamics. But, Harmer's defeat downtown, which, was an incredible U.S. Army that started at Marietta, Ohio. Harmer was a pretty famous and capable guy, a Revolutionary War hero, as was Anthony Wayne. And he came all the way here and went across the ford on the Maumee and tried to flush the village out, and he got hammered and had a couple days of some difficult battles, and basically had to retreat and go back to Cincinnati, was where the big stronghold was. It was called Fort Hamilton. Battle of the Wabash, you probably heard St. Clair's defeat. It happened just over the Indiana line into Ohio on the Wabash. It was the largest defeat of United States regulars by an indigenous force, much bigger than Custer's or anything else. Fort Recovery, when Anthony Wayne came back, and then the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where he broke Little Turtle's alliance with the Shawnee. And it was really Fort Kikianga had become a refugee camp. Delaware, people had been pushed all the way from New York and Pennsylvania. It was a big refugee camp filled with all these different people, and lots of French ethnic people and British as well here in Kikianga. But these were desperate people, and they were trying to make their last stand to keep the young United States out of their homeland. That's the Treaty of Greenville. Greenville is where Anthony Wayne built this giant, the largest wooden fort in North America at the time, just about 90 miles south of here on his slow advance to Kikianga. And everybody said, how did they, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket and everybody in Tecumseh was there. They were all fighting, all these guys. How did they lose? But Anthony Wayne really was methodical. He'd studied Roman legions. He actually was a very important Revolutionary War guy. He was Michikennequa, that was a Little Turtle. He was born up here on the Eel River, and he was a heck of a strategist. He's buried downtown in the old French town, and he's buried with the scissors and the sword that General Washington gave him. He was a great warrior, but then he became a great diplomat, trying to protect his people and keep as many rights as possible in place. He saw the young United States was too strong. He'd given it everything. But his family are still here, and he's buried down there with all the grave goods, scissors, all kinds of things he was presented with. He went out to D.C. and was a pretty famous, neat guy. But one thing, he didn't make it back in his grave. They dug him up for a while and had him on a traveling show, and his skull never made it back. But he's down there along the St. Joseph River. It's right off of Spy Run. Go down there. It's pretty neat. That was an old actual called Frenchtown. That's where a lot of the French folks had stayed and intermarried. Yeah, here's Harmer's Defeat, going back to that. Actually, just an old map. There was a big fort here on the Maumee. There's, of course, downtown Fort Wayne, St. Joseph. This is, what's that, Columbia Street coming up to there, Laurie, those neighborhoods, all that stuff. Here's where the fort was eventually built, but they surrounded it, and Harmer had it was a big troop of regulars and Kentucky militia and a lot of stuff, but it said it was filled with bodies at the fort. They were repulsed. And here's a new artwork of the St. Clair's Defeat over in Fort Recovery, Ohio. Pretty neat little museum there, but 632 soldiers were killed, more than 250 were wounded. They camped in a big rectangle. They were on the road to Fort Wayne. That is the road to Fort Wayne. It's now the Piqua Road. And they were straddling it, and as dawn broke, Little Turtle and Tecumseh was there, and Blue Jacket and Buckongahela, all these Delaware people, and it was an incredible battle, and it was a very sound defeat by St. Clair, he was a Scotsman, but he was a Revolutionary War hero, and his army was completely broken, and they retreated all the way back to Fort Hamilton, which is where Cincinnati, that was a stronghold where they were trying to break it. And then, of course, Anthony Wayne, which we talked about. There's Greenville. That's how big the fort was. Now the town's within the old. There's nothing left of the fort. They're digging it up. And here's the Treaty of Greenville with all these neat signatures of the tribesmen, and actually Richardville, the last chief of the Miami, had signed the Treaty of Greenville that basically stopped hostilities here. Big treaty. Anthony Wayne was something else. Here's a really neat, we've gotten all these maps are coming to light. We know exactly where the fort was, and they've got fishing weirs outlined around there. They had a redoubt they were going to put out here. Nothing was certain, even after the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The British were still very hostile. A few years later, the War of 1812 broke out. But that's where the fort was, and basically there were still French and Indian villages all around it. People never left, really. Pygmy around. Okay, we got, 5 minutes? War of 1812, Tecumseh. He was here, Kikianga. There's General William Henry Harrison, had established the territorial capital. He was the governor of Indiana Territory, and he was stationed where Vincennes is today. And his territorial capital is still there. You can visit it. It's pretty amazing. In his home, Grouseland, where Tecumseh came down from Prophetstown. Prophetstown became a big refuge camp, and it was a strong spot in the Tippecanoe and Wabash confluence, and that's where he was stationed with his brother, the Prophet. That's Brock, it's Tecumseh's brother. He was killed in the War of 1812. General Brock was very close with Tecumseh, and they had a lot of battles that they won together. But William Henry Harrison started at Vincennes and moved up to Wabash. And here's what the War of 1812 happened. These are all the battle sites. Everybody thought it was going to take place in Indiana. There's actually a Terre Haute. There was a Shawnee raid there. There's a little Fort Harrison. Down here is Vincennes. But there's Tippecanoe. The Battle of Tippecanoe, of course, was 1811, right before the war started, with Tecumseh's village. And Tecumseh wasn't there. He was organizing the Cree and the Cherokee. Mississinewa, that's Francis Godfrey, led a battle there. It was a significant, right by Peru. We had battles here at the Fort Wayne, but it actually swept up the Maumee. And Fort Meade's horrible battles. All these were just the worst, awful, very hateful, violent battles, river raising. It ended at the River Thames up there in Ontario, where Tecumseh was killed. Brock was killed at Detroit. But that's the War of 1812, and we invaded, it was called Upper Canada. we invaded Upper Canada. It's called Upper Canada because it was the top of the watershed. I always said, why is it called Upper Canada? It's Lower Canada. It's like Ontario, Windsor. So anyways, Miami, Little Turtle, Richardville, and removal, real quick. Richardville, his house is still out there. We used to smoke cigarettes sitting out there. We'd ride our bikes out there. But he was a chief, Pinsawa, Bobcat. He was actually in these battles. He signed the Treaty of Grenville. I always thought he was all this dandy. You know, they intermarried with the French, and they were all Catholics. Very interesting. And they had these French names, but they had a close alliance with French, and it's now the Miami are all French mixed, really. And he was an amazing diplomat, too. He was a tradesman. He became an economic powerhouse. He controlled the portage. And he held on to it till 1846. You know, the federal removal of people in Indiana, the Potawatomi Trailers, was a decade earlier, 1837. But the Miami, due to his power and influence, stayed on. But then there was a removal in 1846. But he negotiated approximately half state. He had extensive lands. Actually, where I grew up was part of Richardville's land on Wildwood. But approximately half he got to stay, and the rest got removed to Oklahoma. And they still have a divide, a schism between them. That's George B. White, an Englishman, who was painting the Potawatomi removal. That's at Logan's Port. So that's a neat record of those times. Reservations around the portage. This is the public land survey system. Thomas Jefferson was the surveyor. He wanted the United States to be ordered and not have all the problems of territory and boundary that Europe had. So they were going to do this beautiful gridded system. But look at all these reservations, most of Richardville, many other folks that he held on to, and you can still, it's still part. This is the legal description of these areas now, and you can still see them all. This is the Piqua Road, Wayne Trace, that became the old road. It's still there. It actually went right to the fort. And Kilsequa, Little Turtle's granddaughter, Sweet Breeze. She's buried right out here in Roanoke. You can go visit. 1810 to 1910, she spoke only Miami. Some people said she spoke some English. That was her, I think, nephew. His name was Paul Rivard Jr., and he was her interpreter and always along with her. But, you know, 1910, and she had known many of the war chiefs, White Loon, and all those guys that fought, and these veterans that survived all these Indian wars. And she died in 1910. You know, my grandfather was born in 1908, who kind of raised me. So, I mean, she was out there. I mean, that picture's out in Roanoke, where she's buried. And she was last, really, Miami speaker. Here's where Richardville's buried. The big French established the Catholic Church downtown on Calhoun Street. That's his grave. Canal area replacing portage. Well, I got 2 minutes, Allie. Thank you. I'm almost done. We're getting there. We're at the canal, replacing the portage. Canal did not invent the corridor. It industrialized this ancient transportation corridor. Basically, there's where it was, exactly. We had all this stuff coming up to St. Joseph, too, which up Robinson Park, there used to be all the locks at low water. But that's where it went. Shot right down on the edge. It's right out there at the base toe of the slope. And Fort Wayne's a town that was shaped by this geology.